Tom had thought he would have to help with the children, which he was perfectly okay with. They were cute and all, but apparently he was going to be sleeping in the big room with all of them. Well, shit. That wasn't entirely what he had in mind when thinking about getting a place other than the infirmary. He really needed a place to store his stuff. All his things had very graciously been flown or carried up for him and placed in the big hangar space. Most likely so he wouldn't start going up and down the stairs all the time to grab things. Nanook was still very adamant he move as little as possible after all. His quad bike had been moved to one of the barns for the time being, so he just needed a private room to unpack in. That was apparently a big ask though. Sapphire had just answered, "You need to respect privacy to get privacy." Oh, come on! So there he was, lying down in a room full of kids, wondering what exactly he was supposed to do now. From what he had gathered, once Nanook deemed his wounds were fully healed, he would start training with a guard. That sounded fun and all, but he guessed that meant training with a sword, shield and arrow. That was probably smart though, just in case he needed to defend himself with the locally available means. Besides, he had yet to decide if he wanted to impart weapons technology on them. Though it seemed inevitable that, if he taught them about machinery and chemistry, they would figure it out themselves in time. He just didn't want to jump the gun on that point. He still needed a place to keep his things. Currently he didn't even have a weapon on him, trusting that everything was going to be fine. That didn't sit quite right with Tom. Sure, he was probably in the safest place in the keep, but what if... He had no clue what kind of dangers were out there. There were guards posted 24 hours a day though, so something definitely, he thought to himself. He decided on bringing his little logbox into the kids' room, stuffed with a revolver holster and ammo, along with a flashlight and knife. That would have to do, he thought to himself. During the following days, he had been doing as much conversation with the kids as he could, hoping the old saying "you need to hear the truth from kids and drunk men" held true. It had proved sort of correct. He had learned a lot about how things worked here. The Huntresses were the main source of meat during the spring, summer and autumn. The animals they kept were for the winter. With their diet being primarily meat, they got through quite a few animals. The female warriors formed the Huntresses, with the males making up the guard, though everyone here was combat trained to an extent, like a militia, he guessed. The Huntresses and guards would help out with odd jobs when not on duty, like when Fengi and that one guard caught him making breakfast. It was apparently their turn to do so, and they hadn't even said thank you. The kids also confirmed what he had begun to suspect. The women were all a bit larger and stronger flyers. The men were smaller, but still sturdily built, coming close to matching the women in sheer strength. Their society was also dominated by females, thus making Dakota the current heir to Nanook, or Lady Bismarti, if one was being formal. Kieran was apparently Dakota's son. She had cared for him herself for the first year, plus the time in the nest, which sounded to be like half a year. So they were born as eggs. Interesting. After the first year, Kieran joined the kids in the nursery. School started when you were 3 and lasted till you were 10. Then you would join part of the keep to learn a profession. Damned quick process, Tom thought, even if they didn't learn much besides what they needed in their day-to-day lives. Besides, the school was more like a kindergarten with classes. According to one of the older kids, if you wanted to pursue a more formal education, you had to leave for one of the larger cities, as a Puma had done. Apparently, Dakota had a smaller sister, currently in the capital, undergoing such education. Tom had asked how old they get. One of the older kids had heard the tale of an old lady who was over 140 years old. This was apparently rare for them though, so a longer lifespan, Tom had concluded, not too much though. It made sense with them being cold-blooded after all. Kieran wanted to be a guard when he grew up. The second in command of the guard, Anchor, was his father after all, so why wouldn't he want to? When Tom had said he was going to start training with the guards soon, Kieran had insisted on coming along, going as far as to not let go of Tom's legs till he promised. Tom had continued his questioning of the kids. Dakota had 2 sons, Kieran and Holdley, who was a bit older. Holdy wanted to be a blacksmith. The little guy seemed like a pyromaniac to Tom, so yeah, that fit. He needed to check out the blacksmith, he thought. The little girl who had started crying during story time was Esmeralda's daughter. Anatashi, she was called. She and her brother were both 4 years old and seemed very gentle, just like their mother. One big family then, Tom had concluded. He wondered how they got around the whole Sweet Home Alabama situation, but that wasn't really a conversation to have with kids, he thought. He had been a nanny for a few days by now, and it honestly hadn't sucked as much as he had feared. No diaper changing, they were remarkably tidy, and he was otherwise occupied for both his lessons with Sapphire and extra lessons with a puma. As Tom's condition improved, Sapphire had started showing him around the keep and introducing him to everyone properly. Right now they were standing outside the smithy waiting for the door, Sapphire having knocked. "Smith?" Tom had asked. "Yes, Tom, Smith." Shiva had opened the door, looking down at the two of them. Jackalow's mother was easily the largest of them all, and with a broken horn, a missing eye and a wooden leg, her wide shoulders gave her quite the presence. Tom did a double take of the intimidating-looking woman. "So, it's my turn to meet the stranger," Shiva said, seemingly amused by the unexpected visitors. "Hi, I'm Tom." Tom went in his best draconic, holding out his hand. "Hi, Shiva." She took the hand after a moment's hesitation. "Sapphire, you've been teaching him?" "Well, me and a puma. He is learning quickly, but there is still quite a while to go. May we come in? I think he wants to look around." Sure. Does he know not to touch hot things?" Yes, hot, bad." It came from Tom, seemingly impatient to get inside. "Okay then, follow on in." Shiva seemed surprised as he had followed the conversation at least, somewhat. Tom had immediately started going around, looking at everything, and was writing things down in a little booklet. Even if the thing was made of the finest paper Sapphire had ever seen, he didn't seem worried in the slightest about bringing it to a blacksmith. For her part, she had just given up trying to understand Tom's way of valuing things. "He's almost like the world's worst spy. He can certainly write, though," Shiva mused. "Find anything interesting?" "Human use, long old." Tom's amateur draconic clearly being pushed to his limits. "No use, no now." "I think he just called your equipment old-fashioned." Sapphire sounded a bit worried about the reaction to such an insult. "Well, aren't you, rude little bastard?" Shiva said with some merriness to her tone. Oh, thank the gods. She won't beat the shit out of him yet. Sapphire let out a little sigh of relief. The smithy was much like Tom had expected. A large open forge, and several rows of hand tools. Shiva was apparently the smith and craftsman around here. She was also the largest dragonette he had seen so far, standing near 2 meters tall without counting the remaining horn, which added at least another 20 centimeters in height. She wasn't thin or lanky either. With that eye patch, peg leg and broken horn, she looked more like a buff pirate than a blacksmith. She reminded him a little of Jackalow, but she was much older. He placed her around 50 to 55, so that was probably more like 75, he guessed. The kids had said Sapphire was 31 years old, but he had no idea if a year was as long here, and he would put her in her early 20s. He decided against asking the smith her age, though. She had already seemed to take offense at him calling her tools old. As he looked around, he started making plans. If he was going to make anything useful, he would need a workshop. While this place lacked a few things, it was a good starting point. Besides, they had some wind-powered automation driving the forge bellows. Fit for expansion, he thought. What's metal have? God damn it, these sounds were hard to make, but she seemed to understand well enough. She waved him to follow and walked out into a small storage room, hidden behind a curtain. There were several small metal bars and shelves, as well as broken tools, weapons and armour. There was even an instrument or two in the little room. At first glance, Tom could see steel and cast iron mostly. There was a little of what looked like bronze, lead, tin, and a single brass horn. No precious metals though. They would probably be somewhere else, but he knew they had copper, silver and gold at least. But seeing the selection did heighten his spirits. They had the most common metals. He hadn't been expecting to find aluminium or something like that anyway. Brass was very important though, and it was in the scrap pile, so maybe not that expensive either. But judging by the size of the metal bars, metal was expensive around here. They looked to £1 or £2 each. He had been hoping for a big stack of large ingots, but thinking back, that had been quite wishful thinking. He had asked for the names of each metal and written it down as best as he could in English letters. He hadn't got started on writing Draconic. He barely spoke it yet. To be honest, he felt like a tourist on a guided tour with some locals. At least Shiva seemed to find it interesting to learn what her metals were called in other languages. With a list of tools and available materials in hand, he could start planning. His first priority should be machine tools, he thought. He needed a lathe and a milling machine first of all. That was going to be quite the project in and of itself, and they clearly didn't have the materials for it. Not to mention some way of making large castings. The current facilities were clearly designed for forging instead of casting. Those were problems for later though. For now, he needed to focus on learning rather than teaching. Maybe he could get started on figuring out the supply situation.